Evolutionary.org presents Evolutionary Hardcore Podcast with your co-hosts, Steve from the American Underground and Mobster from the UK Iron Den. Get ready for the most hardcore and underground info in the industry. And here we go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
Evolutionary.org Hardcore Podcast coming your way, episode 164. Today we're doing George Peterson, Stevesmi here, and the Mobster. What's up, buddy?
All good. This is going to be nice and nasty. George, a lovely fella, and nasty for what might have been the issues. It's going to be a proper fucking hardcore podcast today, people.
So we're recording this about a month after his death, 3-4 weeks after his death. George Peterson, who was George Peterson? Classic physique pro bodybuilder, became the first Nationals Classic physique champion in history. George always wanted to be the best bodybuilder he could be, even if it meant sacrificing friendships, sacrificing time with his family, and sacrificing his health. He made a switch to classic physique competitions, and that required him to make some crazy changes to his body, but it also pounded down his health. So we're going to talk about all this stuff, guys and gals in this podcast. We're going to talk about his life, his successes, his training, his diet, his steroid cycle, and unfortunately, his recent death. So a little bit about him growing up before I bring in the Mobster for his thoughts. Let me tell you guys about his history. He was born in 1984. He was from Queens, New York. Very gifted guy. He did basketball, football, and karate, believe it or not. And you don't see that too much in bodybuilders. I'm not sure we've seen very many guys who've been bodybuilders who also practice karate. So I found that fascinating. His big fan actually wasn't the typical guys like Arnold or Frank Zane, but it was actually Bruce Lee, which is also interesting because he was born in 1984. And I was born a few years. I was actually, I'm about 5-6 years older than him. And I did not remember anything about Bruce Lee growing up. That was before my time. So I don't know, Mobster, you grew up around Bruce Lee. So I found this interesting. For some reason, he got into Bruce Lee. Maybe an uncle or something used to watch Bruce Lee movies or something. I have no idea. But that was interesting as well. So that's another thing. You don't see bodybuilders growing up idolizing martial artists. That's another thing that was weird. So in one of the ways he got into weight training was by following martial arts because he wanted to do weight training to get stronger. So in the process, by accident, he realized, wow, I'm really good at this. And he noticed his arms and chest started growing. So he started to do bodybuilding shows. So bodybuilding was even more challenging than any of his other sports, football, basketball, martial arts. And he was like, man, I really want to do this. So he realized how much discipline it took and how much dedication it took. So at his peak, when he was ripped, okay, this is when he was at his peak in the physique division, 5'7". So he's not the tallest guy in the world. He's about my height and 195 pounds, absolutely shredded. If you look at pictures of him, we can estimate that his body fat was as low as 3% when he was at his peak. So when you're that low body fat, it's just not natural, to be that low. And it's incredible, but you got to give him credit for getting that low in the first place. Perhaps, Mobster, the most incredible pure physique we have ever seen in bodybuilding history. And his nickname was the Bull, Dabull, kind of like you, the Mobster. He was the Bull.
Yeah.
So give us your thoughts on this, and then we're going to get into his competitions.
You just reminded me. I think the only person I can think of specifically, and there probably are others, is Flex Wheeler, coming from a martial arts background. But something we've just touched upon, and I want to get into the rest properly, is being 3% body fat isn't healthy. It just isn't. I mean, I've seen Clarence Ross, I believe, or Clarence Bass, perhaps Clarence Bass back in the day, and there's different ways of measuring your body fat. But you and I have got an eye. We know how this works. And when you see the guys that are super, super ripped with the veins and the separation, and even sometimes it looks like you can see the muscle fibers, you go, oh my fucking good grief, and it blows your mind. But it's not healthy to stay in that state or to stay that low, or even some of the guys that we know on the forums, we sometimes see this, wanting to be sub 8% all the time. 10% is where you'll see your abs. 8% is when you start to look freaky. When you get down below that, it's an amazing look. It should only be for a very short period of time. Guys, that stress on your system is a bad idea for your immune system. You will be more likely to have infections. You will be tired. You will be hungry. It's not a natural state. But in terms of aesthetic, in terms of how it looks, it's fucking mind-blowing. Guys that come on stage now, sometimes we don't see that. We see a full physique. We don't, in the open classes, you're not seeing ripped to the bone. You're not seeing super dry. There's a balance here, which I'm going to get into properly in terms of, what's good for the sport, what's the look and what's required. But yeah, being 3% is not good for you. Back to you, Steve.
All right, guys. So let's get into his early competition. So the guy, George started competing in 2008. He wanted to compete in the over 220-pound divisions. Years later, he decided to change his mind and decided to make the switch to classic physique, which was, of course, a lower weight class. He had to lose 30 pounds. And that was a challenge that he readily did. So his best accomplishments in the physique, 2017 Olympia Classic Physique third, 2018 Olympia Classic Physique third. Then the next year, Arnold Men's Classic Physique, he won it. And then the Olympic Classic Physique, also third that year. The next year, 2020 Tampa Pro 212 division first, and in the 2020 Olympia 212 division third. So he was very consistent, I would say, getting third place at Mr. Olympia. But yeah, he did win the Arnold Men's Classic Physique, and he did win the Tampa Pro. So, there was no. Yeah, go ahead.
Just want to jump in here, Steve. It occurs to me again, and I don't want to knock George too much because we're going to get into what a nice guy he is as well. Something that Flex Lewis was doing was dropping weight to make weight. Is that an issue possibly for bodybuilders where these guys, and George is a good example, 220 to 212 less. I think the classic physique height weight ratio may have meant that it was less at 5'7". You said 30 pounds. Is that something that people want to do as a bodybuilder? Is that a possible stressor on the system when you go, right, walking around all day long in good shape in a different class at 220, and in order to compete in the classic physique, you've got to lose 30 pounds. And like I said, Flex Lewis is a good example of someone we've seen at 225, 230 a few weeks before the Olympia when he was competing and looking mind-blowing, but having to get down and losing some of that mind-blowingness to 212 to compete in that class. I'm just wondering if that's another stressor on the system. Are we going to get into that in a minute again? Onwards, Steve. Back to you.
So social media has got 400,000 people, almost 400,000 people. I didn't see how many he had before his death. So I'm not sure, Mobster, if that went up quite a bit after his death. That tends to happen a lot. Yeah. We see that all the time. But he does have a pretty good following. He's promoted supplement companies, attire, diet companies over the years. So it seems like he made a good living through endorsements. Let's get into his diet and training. I'll talk a little bit about his diet. Mobster, you can get into his training. So to be ripped like George was, you got to be extremely disciplined when it comes to diet. 0 refined sugars, 0 refined carbs, anything that's going to stand in his way to get ripped. And he also talked about in a video about post-workout nutrition and how important it is. And, he talks about eating within 30 to 60 minutes post-workout. He believes in eating protein and carbs. When you're at that level, that's what these guys have to do. Obviously, a normal Joe, you're not going to die if you don't eat 30, 60 minutes post workout. But he really, was meticulous, and it's really a good disciplinary type of thing to kind of plan your meals like that and make sure that you're getting enough of the protein and carbs that you need. So that was interesting that he doesn't shy away from carbs. You would think someone who is that lean would be like, oh my God, I can't have carbs at all. No, you can have carbs. He didn't have an issue with carbs, but he made sure he stuck to the good complex carbohydrates, the brown rice, the sweet potato, stuff like that, not cake and cookies and donuts. So, yep.
Yeah, I'm just thinking here, Steve, for a second. He's actually kind of, the diet here is kind of sensible in its way. You and I are both aware from the history of the sport that certain people through the game, through time, have mucked around with the diet kind of crazy stuff, like zero fat, for example. Long term, that's not healthy. It's not good for your skin, not good for your mental health. I know of guys out there, when they talk about raw, they're not kidding. Muscle Smoke and Mirrors, author himself, Randy Roach, talks about eating raw meat. So there's been some extreme examples out there. And I don't think this necessarily applies to George in this case, but we do know that sometimes people do crazy shit in order to get in shape, crazy shit to lose that last bit of fat, crazy shit to be ripped. And again, although I don't think it specifically is the issue here with George, it is sometimes an issue with people. And again, when you're combining the drugs, which we'll get into later on, you're putting so many stressors on the system. As I say, George here actually is kind of sensible, having some carbs in there. One thing that you and I could probably discuss if we were coaching a person, we would manipulate the time when the carbs is going in and stuff like that. And I suspect, again, with George, that's probably exactly what he was doing, especially if he was being coached, which I believe he was, prior to competition. So carbs pre-training, not after training, if you're getting ready for competition, that kind of stuff. It's difficult for us to get into with this podcast, the specifics. But again, these are the kind of stuff you need to be aware of, people, when you're thinking about what they're doing. George is actually kind of sensible. There are some crazy approaches out there. Back to you, Steve.
Well, I'm going to throw it right back to you, Mob. So talk about his training, and then we're going to talk about his death and his steroid cycle.
Yeah. That's his training. George, as I said, you've mentioned it already, Steve, that he was competing in a 220 plus class in open competition, or 220 pounds as an open class competitor. And that required, to put that kind of muscle in a 5'7" frame, a lot of heavy weight. So we know that in the past, he's done some big numbers. He's trained for mass, he's trained for power, he's trained for strength. And that put the muscle tissue on the bone. Now, switching to a classic class that requires you, and this is very quick rules, guys, you are allowed to be a certain height, and you're allowed to have a certain amount of weight per height. So if you're taller, you can have more weight. But ultimately, it's kind of across the board, more or less the same. It's just your structure that differs. So in the case of George, he's had to lose weight, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and dropping 30 pounds to complete in the classic. So he realizes no going out there and doing crazy squats, deadlifts, bench, whatever. He needs to do more isolation, be more shape specific, and put in the right, the muscle on the bone's got to be quality muscle on the bone. It has to look a certain particular way. So the lower rep stuff that he's done in the past is put to one side, probably kept in the off season just to keep mass on. But the rest of the time he's sculpting, he's shaping, he's doing more reps, he's doing more specific. Can I build a better peak of my bicep? Can I put the rear head of my delt, and shaping all that kind of stuff? He's got a chest workout, which we refer to with a YouTube link in the article that we attached to this podcast. And you can check that out, guys, just to see exactly what he was doing and get some ideas about the angles and that refinement and that quality stuff that he's looking at. Plus, of course, as Steve and I have addressed in some previous podcasts, your foundation of muscle, what you built on your way up, doesn't disappear. Now you're just trying to look a certain way. Or to quote Arnold, you're trying to sculpt the body. You're trying to be like an artist and produce a certain effect, a certain look. George, for sure, had a look all of his own. Yeah, back to you, Steve.
Well, I thought it was interesting, too. One of the things that I read was, how he switched his kind of training when he started doing the physique. But I wonder, too, though, if the strength training and the low rep, his background, originally ended up paying off when he did make the switch versus just doing the workout as is for physique and then not having that background. So we've seen that.
Yeah, I'll address that now, Steve. Sorry, I'll address that now. There's some guys on the forums younger guys especially that don't know enough about the sport, and they need to either speak to a PT or a coach, get a good book that seems to be better than reading about it online. And a lot of the time, guys, when you're looking at videos of top athletes, you're only getting what they are now. You're not getting what they used to be. So as a good example, Steve, and I'll address this very quickly. If you start with the muscle shaping type exercise, and that's all you did as an athlete, you would not have that mass. You're a complete and utter genetic freak. Doing, for example, concentration curls right from the get-go is not going to build mass. It might give you a little bit of a bubble to your bicep, but you're not going to have that big arm. Whereas if you do the compound exercises, the basics, as we call them, and you do that for years and you build that massive foundation, then you've got something to build on top of. So use an analogy from the sculpting and the artistry stuff, you need a big lump of marble to start with. If you're using, it's real difficult to do it the other way around. So yeah, dropping 30 pounds to get down to the classic thing is a lot easier than coming from a mass and a compound exercise kind of way, and then shaping what you've already got versus trying to build muscle using only compounds. There's no one out there doing 150-pound dumbbells on the compounds that they might be swinging on cheat curls on an easy curl bar, 150, 200 pounds. So you do need the foundation. And trust me, 9 times out of 10, as Steve will know, when we talk to people online, when we talk about coaching, when we see guys in the gym, the guys that get size and they're normal guys are the ones that are doing big deadlifts, big squats, big presses, this kind of stuff. If it's the guys that are on the pec deck from day one or leg extension from day one, these are not going to be mass monsters. It's just not going to happen. They'd have to have genetics of a Greek god for something like that to happen. The rest of the guys, you need to do is hardcore, nasty shit. And George, for sure, even we've been inspired by some martial artists, was a big, strong motherfucker at 5'7", and he was doing some big numbers on the compounds. So that switch, you can't do it the other way around. If you can, you've got some sort of magic bean thing going on, and we've yet to meet you. Back to you, Steve.
So October 2021, George was found dead. Yeah. He was only 37 years old, found dead in his hotel room in Orlando during the prepping for the Mr. Olympia 2021. So put a huge damper on the competition for a lot of guys, especially the guys who were in the physique group. I mean, this is a brotherhood and it's a sisterhood. You know, the competitors are, you know, really close to each other. They're trying to beat each other on stage, but it's still, at the end of the day, you know, it is a brotherhood, and any, you know, beefs that come up, you know, are kind of, in my view, kind of just to get some publicity going. You know, they try to do the whole MMA, the WWE, the wrestling type of thing. Oh, let's get some publicity so more people get interested in it. But bodybuilding isn't, you know, it's, even though it's a selfish sport, it's a solo sport, you know, these competitors really, really love each other in the end. So the organizer of the Mr. Olympia said, our condolences go out to his family and all who respect and admire one of the kindest men we have ever known. And George was, you're not going to find anybody who has anything bad to say about George Peterson. And his Instagram, he doesn't post, this is what Mobster and I discussed on the pre-show, you know, he doesn't put up pictures of him with cars. He doesn't put up pictures of him in a hot tub with 5 women, you know, in bikinis. He doesn't market, you know, this crap, you know, and use like this toxic masculinity type thing to draw in people who are on, you know, the wrong side of history when it comes to helping each other and being selfless and all that stuff. He doesn't cater to that, even though doing that, you know, can bring you in a lot of fans. But he didn't want to do that. He was a good guy. He was a humble guy. He's not a braggart. You know, you don't see in his videos like, oh, I'm the man. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. No, he just worked hard to get to where he was. And the guy was a successful bodybuilder. He won competitions, 3rd place at Mr. Olympia in the physique competition. And he was in line to improve on that, get 1st or 2nd place this year. So, I mean, nobody had a bad thing to say about the guy.
I'm
So
going to get into, I'm sorry, I won't get into this, Stephen. You and I talked about this in the pre-show.
yeah.
So what we do on these podcasts is we're spreading in our own way, Steve, the love of the sport, right? So we could talk about training and how much we like lifting weights. And when we're on the forum, sometimes we can have a good day or a bad day, but ultimately we're sharing information with people that are interested in doing the same thing as us. So there's a positivity to that. There's we're trying to stop guys making mistakes, for example. So that's what we do. We do it on a podcast, we do it on the forum. George seems to me, and you and I have spoken about this already in the pre-show, that one of these guys that had that effect on people. So, for example, Ramy, who won the Open class, mentions him. Chris Bumstead mentions him. Dan Solomon come on stage and mentioned him. Did a specific thing and talked about athletes and mentioned George specifically. And then obviously you've got Jake Wood, who's putting on the promoter of the competition, releasing the statement that you've mentioned already. And what it was is, here's a guy, regardless of his condition, tired, hungry, whatever, when you met him, his face would light up and he made you feel good. He bumped your fist. He was like, how are you doing backstage? And so what the other guys have all said was that this is a bloke that, which like going out for a drink with your buddies. There's the one out, there's like the kind of crazy guy, there's the drunk guy, and whatever else. And there's the one that's making everybody laugh. George is kind of like that as a bodybuilder. You felt good. He's training. He enjoys lifting. He spreads that joy. I like going to the gym. I like fucking lifting weights. I like being strong. Share my love. And that's what's coming across with all these statements. Every person that's met him, like you said, no one's come away with I had a beef with George. George owed me money. He lied. None of that's come out. So this is the thing. We're going to talk about the sport as a whole in terms of getting into condition and what that means in a moment. But George as a person, 100%. I have not seen, and we're talking about, you said 3 weeks. By now, we would have seen something negative. It's just human nature, and we haven't seen a single thing, Steve. So that's what we're talking about. I mean, I use you as an example, Steve, how helpful you are on the forum. Every person that comes on the forum knows what you're like. That doesn't change. That's you all of the fucking time. This is George. Not one person has said a bad thing about him as a person. Now, what I want to get into, and we'll mention the drug specifically in a minute, is the issues of which have come up and which have been discussed as a result of George and as a result of the other issues in the sport with people dying and becoming unwell, etc., which seems to have been very frequent in the last few months. And that is, whether it's George specifically or whether it's the sport as a whole, some of what we're talking about here, and we'll get into the drug stuff as well, is training is wear and tear. Steve and I are big on the forum for talking about getting sleep. Steve specifically has addressed that. I've talked about it. I've referred to Steve and I say, listen, get your sleep, get your rest. Don't be out partying. Don't be out doing drugs. Don't be out staying late. Don't be going crazy on the stims. That's another one of Steve's. Don't be doing stupid fucking drugs to get in shape because you left it too late. And that kind of stuff. And what we are seeing is this argument about whether the sport needs to take a step back. Guys that get in crazy condition are doing crazy things to get in crazy condition. And then we'll see like an open class competitor criticized for not being in condition. Guys, and that's just whether it's a sport for the judges or whether the sport as a whole, you can't fucking have it both ways. You can't tell the guy that he needs to be in ripped to bone condition and then not do stupid fucking shit to get there. And then you get into Steve and I are talking about here, is this shit getting crazy, taking stupid amounts of drugs, fucking healthy? And the short answer is no. It takes a certain kind of personality type, driven, obsessive, sometimes with borderline mental issues, and I say that as nicely as possible, to take things to an absolute extreme. I say that for myself as a lifter. I needed to be mentally in a different place from the other athletes. I'm not doing the diuretics. I'm not doing DMP. I'm not taking crazy amounts of stims. Heck, I don't even like taking a pre-workout. But for bodybuilding, that's kind of the stuff you need to do, and that ties in with the crazy diets. George, for example, posting, I believe, online or something, replying to text or whatever at 2:30 in the morning. Was that because he was wired? Was that because he was up late? What, maybe he's a night guy. But even being up late, even doing night shifts, and especially if you're dieting as a bodybuilder, training and doing all the other stuff, even doing night shifts is not healthy. People that do night shifts or stay up late tend to be less healthy than those that go to bed at sunset in the daytime, that kind of stuff. And I'm going to ask you, Steve, to talk about a little bit from your perspective, and obviously when we get into the drugs, what do you think about the extremes that some bodybuilders are doing, and strength athletes for that matter, to get into shape in terms of the stress on their system and extremes of behavior?
Yeah, it's extremely stressful. And, we had this talk on the pre-show as well. It was obvious that these competitors, they're on a lot of stimulants. And what the stimulants do is it cuts your appetite. Because what happens is you're on all these PEDs, all these steroids, all this growth hormone, and it's going to make you hungry. And to counteract all that hunger, you can take stimulants, and stimulants can blunt your appetite. But here's the thing with stimulants, they don't work over a long term when it comes to appetite unless you keep increasing the dosage or you cycle them. So in this case, with these competitors, it's very likely that they're not only taking, not just, drinking a lot of caffeine, and taking a lot of energy drinks and stuff like that, but also taking supplements that are stimulants. And some of the supplement brands that he pushes on, that he reps for are heavy on the stimulants, because stimulants are mostly legal. I mean, they're legal. Certain stimulants like DMA have been banned in the past, thankfully, but there are plenty of, you can go to a gas station right now, anywhere, and just pick up enough stimulants to kill you, to give you a heart attack. I mean, you could drink 20 energy drinks and kill yourself from, giving yourself a stroke. So, I mean, this is what these guys have to do to get to this level. And the thing is with him, he took it to the extreme. He was third place and he wanted to get that second place or first place. He wanted to go up. There's a lot of pressure on these guys. They want to win. They're type A personalities. To put yourself through this, you have to have that. You have to have that mentality. So on the day that he was found dead, his coach, Justin Miller, could not get a hold of him. Nobody was able to get a hold of him. So he went to his room and found him face down on the floor. They called 911 and tried CPR, but it was too late. He had passed away hours earlier. He had been dead already. So what we know, Mobster, there's some speculation. Obviously, they have got to do an autopsy and all that stuff, but that probably won't be made public I don't think, I think his family, it's a time for privacy. So I'm not sure if that will mean, it would be nice for us to find out what exactly killed him and why he died, because it can prevent deaths in the future. But the early rumors, which makes a lot of sense, was there was blood coming out of his nose, which could have meant he died of an aneurysm. Yeah. So an aneurysm means you have a weakened area in the artery that could have ruptured and led to internal bleeding and stroke. So once that happens, the person can lose consciousness and you must get medical aid. In his case, he collapsed in his room and there was no ability to get him medical aid. So we're going to kind of talk about, we're going to get into the opinions on this. We're also going to talk about a steroid cycle. It's very important to go over this. And I have an opinion on this and I want to hear yours as well. So let me talk about my opinion and then I'm going to bring in you, Mobster. So basically, there's been 14 major deaths in the past decade in bodybuilding. So there's no other sport that has that. You have deaths in some sports, but we haven't seen anything. I mean, no one dies in these sports like on the field. It's very, very rare. So my opinion, and that this could have prevented this death, this could have at least gave him a chance, Mobster, is why not have a roommate stay with them at all times and also have them be required to check in every hour with their coach or trainer, because we know his coach trainer traveled with him. It's on his social media. They were on the airplane together and they did a selfie on the plane. And so he has an entourage going with him. Why is this person not checking up on him at least every hour, or spending time, sleep in the same room, get a double bed and sleep in the same freaking room? get a bed and sleep on the couch. Your trainer should be with you 24/7 and make sure that you are okay. Why was he in the room by himself for hours straight? And why did people, when they couldn't get a hold of him, just ignore him? Did they think, oh yeah, maybe he wants time to himself? I mean, this doesn't make any sense. They also, and a lot of people aren't gonna like this one, Mobster, but have their health checked leading up to the competition by an independent doctor, just like they do in the NFL. In the NFL, when you take a hit in the NFL and you're on the ground and you're woozy, they take you off of the field and an independent doctor takes you to check on you and make sure that you're okay to go back in the game. And he makes a decision if you get the play or not the team doctor or not the coach who's going to be biased. And that will prevent problems like this. And if they're not well enough to compete, okay, if they're not well enough to compete, their high blood pressure, their heart, their cholesterol is out of control, they're not healthy enough to compete, guess what? They can compete, even if it means half the people can't make it into the competition. I'm sorry that, it has to be like that, but if you want to fix the problem, that's what you have to do. In every sport out there, every sport, they have the best trainers, the best doctors looking after their athletes, right? But how come in bodybuilding, these supplement companies are making billions of dollars, trillions of dollars even? It's a huge industry, but they can't afford to chip in. Every supplement company that sponsors the Olympia should chip in money to hire these independent doctors that have to make sure that these guys are healthy. So if George had really been under a care of a doctor who actually cared about him and was in his best interest, not the Mr. Olympia best interest, they would have removed him from the competition and potentially saved his life. So, it's really a shame. And, he was a great man, loved by all. And it's a shame we lost a great human being. And, we've done a lot of these podcasts and we've discussed, guys who've been murderers and convicts and bad guys and guys who are just nasty, negative people. But George was one of the good guys. So we keep losing the good guys. And that's the problem. And Arnold actually brought up the point that bodybuilding hammers the organs. So it's inside that's dying, while other sports affects the outside. They get, injuries, broken bones and ligament tears and concussions and stuff like that. But bodybuilding is about inside the organs. So it's hidden. So really, he says that bodybuilding should be about health and fitness and this should be fixed. So I don't think that's going to happen. That's wishful thinking. But I mean, what's your thoughts? Give us your thoughts, Mobster. Yeah,
I'll give you an example and something in my notes that I made for this podcast. I said protecting the sport. I'll make it real simple for you people. We can go with the back and forth. We know that, for example, being ripped, being dry, standing on stage, looking amazing is not healthy, and it's been addressed by multiple bodybuilders when they say that the time that I'm supposed to look the best is for the time that I feel the worst, hungry, low glycogen. Your brain's not working right. Your body's having to call out which poses to do because you can't fucking remember your left and your right because that's how fucked up you are in a perverse way. And I get even for myself in competition. In order for me to break world records and do some of the stuff I've done in the past, I'm risking injury. And like Steve says, that comes from being that personality type. So I get that. Steve gets it. We understand it. We've lived that part. We get it. Right? Equally, you got to protect the sport. Because what do you want? Do you want the fucking government in your country, in the US? Do you want the federal government in the US? Do you want the UK government here, as I do this podcast with Steve, telling you what needs to be done in the competition, making laws, banning competition? Is that what you want? Because that's potentially what you're talking about. If the federal government in the States goes, do you know what? We've looked at this sport and you've got too many people dying just to compete, because that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about a guy getting a broken leg on a football pitch, which has happened, broken leg, sorry, in the football pitch, which happened a couple of times ever in the whole of the American pro football, and everybody's crying. I've seen those videos. They're absolutely crazy. And so you never had helmets, and now you've got helmets. You didn't have pads in the days, and now you've got pads. That's the way that's gone. And the sport kind of did it to itself. But if you hadn't done it, would the federal government have stepped in and said, you can't have American football? Can you imagine that, Steve? Can you imagine a sport that cannot take place because too many people are dying? And that's kind of what we're getting at here. We've talked about extremes of diets with female competitors making them ill and dying. When you've got Boston Lloyd, Mr. 3cc, talking about the extremes in his, it's like, oh my God, how much as for the thyroid drugs that one female athlete was on. When you've got Mr. CCE's reputation is based on extremes of PED use, shocked at what's being used by female bodybuilders to get into shape. And that was the ones that were able to speak on the podcast that he was doing, never mind the ones that had passed away. Do you need the federal government? Do you want the government to police bodybuilding competitions? Because that's potentially the extreme that we could go to, where people are dying in their hotel rooms before they've got on stage, where you've got guys having to be taken off stage, where people are having to have oxygen on stage. You're literally just standing there flexing your muscles, male or female, and there's people bending over at the waist. There's people so unhealthy that they're having to go backstage and take a mouthful of oxygen. So unhealthy they have to go. I mean, as an example, one of the things that I addressed in a previous podcast was, and I've mentioned this on the forum, they're getting so dry that one of the things that was suggested was that there's immediately after a competition, as soon as you've done those photographs and you got dressed, they would go to one of these places that could put you on a saline drip to rehydrate you. And that was to protect your organs. And that's how crazy things can seem to be. And that's the sort of behavior, that's the sort of risk factor where people then die in the night before a competition. That would have the federal government stepping in, would have the local authorities saying, you know what, you can't have a bodybuilding competition because people die. And you're going, listen, there's like 900 athletes here. Maybe only one of them's going to die here, but that's not going to happen. That's not how people think. And that is a crazy situation to be in. As my notes is how harmful are PEDs. When we talk about some of the cycles that we've addressed before, the great joke in bodybuilding for many years has always been up the trend, up the trend, up the trend. And everybody knows what a great drug it is. And equally, we also know what a massive stressor on the system it is. Medical checkups pre-competition, as Steve said, listen, if you're paying, as some athletes have had to do, $500 just to compete, and another $150 to $200, sometimes more, just to get spray tan, and other bits and pieces that can end up costing $1,000 total, then another $20, $30 to contribute towards a very simple medical test, because they would know what to look out for. How bad are your lipids? Are you huffing and puffing when you're standing in front of the doctor, just standing there? Are your eyes jaundiced, just standing there in front of the doctor? I think, Sunshine, you might need to go and have a sit down. It's that kind of vibe. It wouldn't need to be a complicated checkup. You'd be able to see the person, and within 2 or 3 minutes, Steve, a couple of real simple tests. If your lipids are really off the chart, what's your potassium levels like? You know, can you pee? That kind of stuff. So they're real simple stuff. And then, like I said, it might be even and something that's not addressed, which could be addressed with. I know that some sponsors do this, and that is that they have you take a medical examination before they'll sign the contract with you. So what they're looking at there, Steve, and again, it might have been an issue. It might have been part of what we're talking about. Is pre-existing medical conditions. We know of guys in all the sports that we're fans of and the sports we've taken part in ourselves, where people can sometimes come in, as I mentioned earlier, with pre-existing mental issues, but pre-existing physical issues. Should you, for example, not use certain PEDs, if your liver's fucked already from years of alcoholism, for example, maybe you've got a pre-existing genetic condition. And these are the kind of things. So I know that some sponsors are doing this. Perhaps it's something that you need to do as a pro athlete. You get your pro card, and conditional on your pro card every year when you're renewing your card, or every time you have to renew your card, is you have to go to a doctor that they tell you to go to, and he produces a workup of your numbers, and he sends it off to the federation, and the federation says his numbers are good, he can carry on competing as a pro. If it gets to the point where perhaps you should stop competing as a pro because your numbers are absolutely awful, you need to go away and get better. You need to improve those numbers, but do it, as you said, Steve, with an independent doctor. It's this stuff that will stop us being federalized, will stop having the government step in, because that's the last thing we want. We want this degree of independence. So guys, look after yourself. Let's get into the steroid cycle of an athlete like George, Steve, and talk about some of the effects that these steroids and other bits and pieces would have had on the body as well. And again, it's like we say all the time, people, this is not necessarily George's cycle, but it would be a cycle of a person like George competing at that level. And again, the effects that they would have had. To you, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, it's a gray area. What killed George Peterson? Was it the steroids directly? No.
Yeah.
Was the steroids contributing to it? Absolutely. Would all these other things that he's taking contribute to it? Absolutely. Whereas the stimulants, absolutely contributing. But you can't point to one thing. That's the problem with this. So let's go over the cycle here of what these guys are doing. So 200 milligrams a day trenbolone acetate. Mobster mentioned tren. It is required for a bodybuilder who wants to win in place at these competitions. They must use tren, because tren is the most incredible steroid out there. And if you're not using tren and the guy next to you is, that gives them a huge advantage. All these guys have tremendous genetics, all of them. All these guys work their butts off in the gym. All of them follow a very strict diet. All of them have coaches. All of them have trainers, okay, that guide them along. So they've got to keep up with each other. So tren is extremely important. It's an incredible nutrient partitioner. It's incredible for cutting down. It's incredible for shredding. It's incredible when you're eating in a deficit or not eating at all. It's incredible for still growing muscle on your frame. That's what it does. It was designed for that purpose in the first place. So why acetate? They like to run the shorter esters to stay flexible. If they want to switch the tren out, if they want to put something else in there, if they want to move the dosage around, that gives them the flexibility. If you're using trenbolone acetate, long ester, and you want to up the dose, it's going to take longer to reach a higher level in your body because it's a longer ester. It's more spread out. The ester releases slower than the acetate. The acetate's in your system quicker, and it's also out of your system quicker. So how much was he using? 200 milligrams a day, not a week. 200 milligrams a week makes me nuts. Okay. They're taking a day. So that is an incredible amount of tren to use. Winstrol, 200 milligrams a day, not a week, not 40 milligrams a day, which adds up to 200 milligrams over a course of a week. 200 milligrams a day they're using a Winstrol. And why Winstrol? Winstrol dries you out. So it will polish the muscle, give you those cuts. Just look at a picture of George and you can see how polished he is, how dry he is. There's not a speck of water on his frame. The other one, Masteron propionate, 200 milligrams a day. Usually guys, Masteron, 500 milligrams a week, 400 milligrams a week. This guy's 200 milligrams a day. Now, Masteron is absolutely incredible for hardening. Look at his muscles. Look how hard his muscles are. You think that you can get like that naturally? Of course not. His muscles were hard as a rock. I can't imagine how he sleeps at night. He must have an extremely soft mattress, because if you have a firm mattress and you're sleeping, it's going to be like you're sleeping on rocks. Go outside and grab a bunch of rocks and throw them on your bed and sleep on it. That's what it feels like. I know, because I've been there, done that. I've used Masteron before and my muscles were so hard. It was ridiculous. The other one, I'm going to bring in Mobster to give us his thoughts. Equipoise, 1,200 milligrams per week. Now, why Equipoise? It does everything these other steroids do, but a lesser degree. It's got less side effects. So it's basically just something to throw in there to give the cycle kind of a more of a completeness to the cycle. So it's more, it's not going to cause a water retention, and it's not going to cause, your side effects to get much worse. I mean, it's as bad as it can be already with the side effects, but it's not like gonna be taking it to a different level. So yeah, I mean, that's what these guys use, guys. And you can take a look at their physiques and just see how ridiculously shredded they are and how tight they are, the tightness of their muscles. And another thing with George too, he was bald. And I tell you guys all the time, go on social media and these guys who are claiming natty, and then they're like bald by the time they're 30 years old. Okay, that's not normal to be bald by 30. Obviously, they abuse the crap out of steroids in their 20s. So when you're using these steroids, these dry compounds, these DHT derivatives, the Winstrol, the Tren, the Masteron, to a lesser extent, the testosterone, even the Equipoise to a lesser extent. But when you're using and abusing steroids, that DHT conversion in the body and that direct DHT effect will attack those hair follicles on your head. So your hair follicles on your head are going to get fried. And when they get fried, your hair falls out. So no doubt, you can tell the guys who are abusing steroids, who are claiming, oh, I'm natty. Come on. It's kind of obvious that you're not natty. So yeah, Mobster, finish this up. What else do you think he was taking here?
I've made some notes here, Steve, and I'll touch on these very quickly. Building muscle while you're dieting is not natural. And what I mean by that, you touched on it when you said, talking about the trend specifically, that you're dieting down, you're getting leaner, and sometimes you're building muscle. That doesn't happen in nature. If you don't do that if you're not using drugs, it doesn't happen. You don't add muscle tissue on a restricted diet. Even the so-called recomposition would require something about you, and all the recomposition stuff that we address on the forums nearly always involves a drug. Again, you'd have to be an absolute genetic freak, and even allowing for George being that way, it's not something that happens in nature. People don't grow when they're on something that's less than before. So there's an element there. Steve touched on being super lean and how uncomfortable it is. I'm reminded, Steve, very quickly of Dorian Yates talking about that his lowest body fat, he was wearing slippers or slide-ons, something like this backstage. And he said that the last bit of fat in his body that would go would be in the soles of his feet. He said, I knew that I was lean because it would be uncomfortable, painful to walk around backstage at a competition where the bones and the meat were pushing on the skin. There was no fat, there was no soft tissue in there. It all kind of gone. The water was gone. And so it was literally physically painful to walk around when he was that lean. Something else as well in terms of stressors and stuff. And I'm not a fan of blasting and cruising. When we talk about people staying on, now sometimes what happens, and it's specifically with what we call professional or competing athletes, they will address this and they'll have a specific plan. Not always, but as a good example, I'm going to do drugs for 5 years and see where this takes me. I'm going to blast and cruise for 10 years and see where this takes me. I have the genetics to compete. I want to compete. And then you get things like, for example, you didn't qualify at one competition, so you have to do another competition a few weeks later, which requires you to stay on. So before you know it, you're blasting and cruising for 5 years, sometimes in the extreme examples, 10 years. And essentially your plan, your great plan, is that when these 10 years are up, when these 5 years are up, I'm coming off drugs and I'm going to get healthy. Unfortunately, it doesn't fucking work like that. If you're doing a drug, and I don't care what kind of drug you're doing, but if you're a meth user or a coke user or something like that, and you do drugs for that period of time, it's going to have, and Steve will back me up on this, a lifelong effect. You can't do 10 years of steroids and at the end of 10 years go back to how you was before. Even if you lose all the muscle and all the strength and you just go back to being a normal guy, there will be a number of stressors in those cycles that you did for 10 years that would have fucked something in your system that's never going to go back to normal. I don't care who you are. It's just not going to happen. You might bullshit yourself it's going to happen, but it won't. So you need to be aware of that, guys. The stuff that you're talking about is potentially life-changing in terms of the length of time you're on. You do need to have time off. You do need to come away from all PEDs. Let's get into the last few drugs here, Steve. And what we're talking about here again, guys, is drugs coming in and out of cycles, especially when you're pre-competition. So, for example, we're talking about 50 milligrams a day of test prop here, cut 3 weeks out. And some drugs are kept in because they're keeping muscle on you while you're dieting, fine, like we just said, but not natural. And other drugs are dropped a few weeks out because if they hold water in the system, they make you look a little bit bloated, they affect your glycogen levels, that kind of stuff, super crazy pumps, this kind of thing. And you want some of them to come out of your system, or at least to be lessened in your system, so that they approach the competition, you get leaner, you get more conditioned, etc., etc. That will be specific with test prop. Now, the stimulants, which Steve mentioned a few times already, we know that some of the guys are still using stimulants, whether that's crazy amounts. For example, Steve, if you're taking a pre-workout, pretty much all the strong pre-workouts contain 400 milligrams of caffeine. The Americans, and to a lesser degree, but we're not far behind you, UK and elsewhere, we're drinking more coffee, we're having more caffeine than we've ever done. And if you're doing that and having pretty much a daily dose, a daily recommended dose in one product, pre-workout, and then having more coffee through the day, you're having too much caffeine. And then there are other things that Steve said already, DMMA and other ingredients, and it does vary. Are you using these things all the time? Are you using on top of your coffee and your tea and whatever else? Are you doing it on top of a restricted diet? So you need to be aware of that. When we get into the nasty, horrible stuff, which me and Steve have been down on this podcast before, are you, because you left it too late to get in condition, you didn't follow your diet, you cheated more than you said you did, are you going to do something stupid like use DNP? That's just, we could bang that drum all day long in terms of how stupid an idea that is. So be aware sometimes, just with the stimulants, for example, look at the things that you're doing. Are you using this product and this product and this product and not adding up the numbers? You go, I'm taking this pre-workout, I'm using this to get me into shape, I'm having 2 cups of really strong coffee. Oh, I didn't realize I was taking 1,000 milligrams of caffeine a day. Realize, write it down, have a look at it. Are you doing stuff that if you take, for example, most people train, the busiest time in gyms is in the late afternoon, around 5-6 o'clock, when you finish work. For most people, finish school, you hit the gym, you're taking a stimulant, and then you're complaining about being wired, and you're just an amateur. You're not even a competing bodybuilder. If you're doing that as a pro, and you're doing all the other things that pros do, then you're kind of hammering that now multiple times with all different kinds of hammers. You're not giving yourself a break. You need to watch the amount of stims in your diet. Again, it's a necessity, so to speak, being a professional bodybuilder, to do stuff that give you that edge, but watch the effect. Again, if you've got heart issues or breathing issues, lung issues, and you're doing this kind of stuff, if you find it difficult to sleep at night without stims, then doing stims on top. And then again, if you're not getting enough sleep, you're not recovering. So there's stuff like that. All competition diets, to one degree or another, are unhealthy. Diuretics. This is a major one, and specifically the one that we've got over it, the last one here, letrozole. Right. So diuretics, some are, I believe, and I'm not a diuretic expert, but some are magnesium sparing, some are potassium sparing, some are not. And we've talked about this before. When the top bodybuilder in the world at the time, Ronnie Coleman, tells the story about being on the bed and feeling like he needed to go to hospital and drinking a gallon, 8 pints of water prior to going on stage, unfortunately losing that water through the day, and ended up being better literally in the morning. As Steve said, his coach wasn't there. He had to ring his coach up, Chad, and say, Chad, I feel like death. I feel like this, my muscles are cramping. I can't do this. I can't do that. Chad wasn't in the room with him. He was out with other athletes. And he says, go and get a gallon of water, drink this water, get some of this back in your system. When we talked about the saline drips for diuretics after a competition, going back on saline just to rehydrate. When you're talking about taking drugs and say you get into trouble and a medical, ER, what we call that, paramedic comes to see you in your room. Have you specifically told him what drug you've taken, when you took it, how much pee you've peed out, what was the color of the pee? You know, do they know to put you on this saline with this in or not? They could kill you if they give you too much of a mineral because you've got so much in your system already and you're dehydrated. And I mean, there's a letrozole, when we talk about letrozole, both with diuretics and other stuff, for example, crashing your estrogen, having that is a bad idea. Having all of these drugs can affect your blood pressure, for example. Some of the drugs, not necessarily the ones listed, but other drugs thicken your blood. So it's we can complain about small things like, oh, I take such and such a drug and the pumps were awful to the point of being painful. And that's easy fix. You stop taking that drug for a couple of days, that kind of goes away. You can take taurine to address that. But how about you're taking a drug and your heart's struggling? How about you're taking a drug and you're breathing like a sort of exhausted horse all the time? We've actually seen people being interviewed after training, not at a competition, and while they're being interviewed, they sound out of breath while they're being interviewed. And that's either a medical condition or drug related. And trust me, more often than not, it's drug related. So we have to get into this. We have to say, and guys should never forget this, some cycles are healthier than others. You can talk about lowering the dosages. You can talk about different drugs. So, for example, how many times have Steve and I have seen guys not realize how bad the side effects trend can be? Well, then you're an idiot. And I say that nicely, guys, because there's no reason for you not to refer to the information that's available on our forums and on a million other forums. You go, you look at the trend side effects. If you take more of a powerful drug, then you're going to have more problems with side effects. This is really quite simple. Now, just this weekend on the forum, we were just talking about a particular peptide. Specifically, it's a medication that's used to treat type 2 diabetes. And the person in question claimed a body fat of 8% and wanted to get down to 5%. I looked into this drug, and it was one of those wonderful drugs that helps you lose weight, but with twofold. One is it's an appetite suppressant. So you're already on a diet to stay lean, and it's going to make you less hungry to get leaner. But at the same token, as we quite often see with fat loss drugs, there's the issue of diarrhea, a specific fat loss drug where, for example, everybody was getting greasy stools. There's an image you want people in your mind. That's the stuff that was going out to the mass market that wasn't even being used by bodybuilders. So again, these drugs come with side effects. You need to be aware. Mostly it's dose dependent. It's meant for the time that you're on cycle. When you're messing around with diuretics, for example, and the minerals that are being depleted or increased in your system can affect your heart rate. So, for example, your heart can speed up or your heart can slow down. Now you're standing on stage, ripped to the bone, and your heart's racing. So you're breathing fast. You're still sweating out the water, and you're getting more and more ill as you stand there looking amazing. And again, this doesn't come across when you're talking about a competition. When we're sitting in the crowd, when we're cheering, oh, he looks fantastic, he looks amazing. He kind of probably feels like beating up dog shit. And again, you need to have this kind of stuff in the back of your mind, guys. You need to know that you can't roll a dice and hope for the best. You need to be aware of these things. And as Steve said, the idea, and it's not very nice, that George or any athlete, Dallas McCarver is a very good example, both these guys were well liked and they died on their own in a room, arguably as a result of what they were doing to be great bodybuilders. When you've got female athletes that are taking extremes of thyroid amounts, streams of stimulants to lose weight because they wasn't as strict as they should have been on a diet, and they're going to like the craziest coach they can, who says, yeah, you'll get into shape. And he's not there. And the coach I'm thinking of is supposed to have had 200 competing athletes under him and 1,000 total people, and he's not with you. He's not there. He's not fixing the issues. He doesn't know really how bad you are. Not being honest when you're talking to them, that kind of stuff. There's so many things here. Steve and I have talked to athletes. We've worked with athletes. I've encouraged people to do this. I've spoken about that kind of stuff. And you say, and when you've got young people that have got no real reason to be doing this kind of stuff, asking you about these kind of things, you've got to wonder, because to them, they'll just see this hero doing what he's doing and wondering about if he does that and it worked for him, blah, 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 and then he's dead, mate. Now what do you think? Now what do you, young person that was just coming to the sport, that followed Dallas or followed George, now what do you think? Do you want to carry on doing the stuff that they were doing because that's how you want it to look? That's the kind of crazy questions we need to ask Steve. What do you think?
Look, at the end of the day, like, nobody cares. Nobody cares that George Peterson died. Nobody cares these bodybuilders died. The Mr. Olympia, the sponsors, none of them give a shit. Let's just be honest. about it. Their one objective is to make money. So, and the thing is, if they put any of these things into place where they'd have to have independent doctors, they'd have to check up on the athletes, the athletes would have to pass a physical and all this stuff, which every other league has, by the way. Like when you get signed to an NFL team, you have to pass a physical. When you get signed to an NHL team, you have to pass a physical. I mean, that's just common sense. But in bodybuilding, you don't have to pass shit. So at the end of the day, like they don't care about the people's health. So they just care about the money, and nothing's going to change. Like you really think, like Arnold, talks about this, and he talks about, oh, it should be about, health, and it should be about this, should be that. And it's just like, it's not going to ever be that, because people just want to see these physiques. They want to go and see these incredible, it's not even human. It's just not what a person should look like. It's not the amount of muscle that should be on the frame. It's not the amount of body fat they should have. It doesn't make any sense. Their organs basically are dead inside at this point. And whether you die quickly, as George Peterson did, or whether you die a slow death, which most bodybuilders will die a slow death and die really young, and in his case, he knew he was in trouble. It wasn't just something magically that came up. This isn't the first time he's had a health issue. He probably felt like crap all night. And then the next morning, he probably woke up and felt like crap. But you know what? He knew if he went to a hospital, it wouldn't look good for him. He'd lose endorsements. He'd be pulled out of the competition. It wouldn't look good for him. And his trainer knew the same thing. His trainer could have knew. I don't know. I mean, I hope not, but it's possible. They put in so much work to get to that point to just pull out, and we see that in boxing. We see boxers who go in the ring and they're not ready. They're not in good enough shape to be out there. They get killed if they go out there. You know what those boxers do? We see this all the time. They just freaking go down on the first punch, and I'm good. I'm good to go. I'm going to make my money. But if they pull out, they don't get paid. So it's like, just get in there, do your thing, and you're good. You're paid. So he was worried about that. He was worried about pulling out. If he pulled out, that was a year's worth of busting his ass down the drain, because there's only once a year you have Mr. Olympia. So he didn't want to take that risk. So at the end of the day, nothing's going to change. Expect more deaths. We're going to keep doing podcasts on these people who die. No one's going to learn a lesson. And that's just how it is. And what else, people don't care about is that bodybuilding. No one cares about bodybuilding, because if you say, ask anybody, you guys listening to this, ask your girlfriend, ask your boyfriend, ask your cousin, ask your uncle or parent, oh, did you hear George Peterson died? They're going to be like, who? Who the hell is George Peterson? We don't know who George Peterson is. So nobody even knows about this news. So it's a nothing burger. It's a nothing burger. It'll be swept under the rug. We'll continue to have bodybuilders die, and nothing will be fixed. That's my prediction. Let's see if I'm right. 5 years from now, we'll be talking about the next 6-7 guys that die, so finish it up, Mobster, and we'll go to the end of this.
If it costs money, then we see a change. And let's give you an example. I was just thinking, motorsport, specifically Formula One. There are some famous examples over the years of Ayrton Senna, and I forget the name of the fella that was in the car. He's a leader, or was a leader of one of the teams who was covered in burns. We've seen photographs of cars flipping in the air. We know that one driver was beheaded as a result of coming off onto the gravel at the side of a track, and they had a forklift truck there to move broken down cars, and his vehicle slammed into the forklift truck, and one of the forks took his head off. So what happens in Formula One is that every single time there's an accident, it seems to me they fix the problem. No, this forklift truck will be behind the barriers. They've changed the framework on cars, so there's now a kind of piece of frame in front of the driver. He doesn't block his view because his eyes and his helmet's just on either side. But so he can see where he's going in the car. You have the whole carbon fiber nose cone of the car, which is meant to take the energy out of a crash from some crazy 26, 36G down to nothing in a few seconds. It stops the guy's eyes popping out of his head. It stops him having neck injuries. With the halo system, I think it's called, where they have like a restraint on the back of the head, on the helmet, to stop the head smashing forward into the cockpit of a car, and all these kind of stuff. The harness systems that they use, the fire retardant uniforms that they wear, the gloves, the undersuit, etc. Never mind the sponsor stuff on top, you are protected underneath. And that's because every single big accident, originally when the sport started, no one give a fuck. You'd have a death one weekend and they'd be racing the next weekend. The guys that were crying over you one week would be out racing against the other guys next week. And then once the big money came, big money sponsors, if you're talking about banks and oil companies, etc., they didn't want the deaths on their thing. It's the reason, arguably, Steve, why we still don't get, when we only just starting to see it, and even then it's extreme sports sponsors, big money sponsors hooking into bodybuilding. We've had it a couple of times over the years, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Big money sponsors came in and then they left again. Big TV companies came in and then they left. No one stuck around. You're not seeing Nike and Adidas sponsoring this stuff. If you did, they would not want their athletes and the competition that they sponsored with those athletes in to result in deaths. It's not good for the sport, and it certainly wouldn't be good for that sponsor. You're not going to sell more Nike trainers if a Nike training athlete is competing and he dies, because the association with you as a sponsor suddenly becomes a really negative one. And as a good example of this, I believe, but don't quote me, that George was a Redcon 1 athlete. And he's not the only Redcon 1 athlete that's died. When the owner of Redcon 1 has to do, and he says in his own words, I wasn't expecting to have to do this again, and then tell you, you know, how sad they are that this athlete's passed away, what a great guy he was, like we've done. That's not a good thing for that company. That's not a good thing for the sport. The moment it costs them money, the moment, like I said earlier on, if you get the federal government coming in, the local authorities coming in, right, we're going to test your athletes. We're gonna fine you if people die. If you want your organization, your association to be legal and bonded and protected and certified and all official, more legit, like a small business or medium or big business are, there's a number of hoops that companies have to jump through just to be able to do, for example, health and safety in a factory. Same thing goes with an association. If the government steps in and says, we will not allow your association to exist as a legal entity unless you're testing your athletes for these things, if that's what you want, guys, then carry on doing stupid shit. If you don't want that to happen, if you want to have that certain level of freedom, if you want to be able to make certain choices, then you need to be aware that some of these things are happening. And Arnold's a good example, Steve. He puts on the Arnold Classic. They invite athletes. They look after their athletes incredibly well, with hotel rooms and training outfits and quite often shoe sponsors, low-level shoe sponsors, etc. So you turn up at your room. You've got a room that they provided. You've got money per day for food. That's without necessarily winning. You've got an outfit to wear, sponsors, logos, etc. You've got shoes and so on. The Olympia gives you a great jacket to wear, and that's a badge of honor in and of itself. If you're going to do those kind of things, then it's not beyond you, as Arnold says himself, to make that stuff happen. He can say, this is what I want for the sport, but he can make it happen at the Arnold. He can say, guys, I'm going to invite you to the competition. You're going to get $200 a day. You're going to have a great room with a little kitchen. You're going to all these things. But when you sign the contract, you agree to be seen by a doctor. And we'll pay you the $200, but you're not going to be on stage if I find out you're a death's door, if I find out you're fucked up, if I find out that your heart won't handle it, if I find out your potassium levels are out the window. Arnold can do that. He can afford to do it. He can afford to do the sponsorship, etc. Will he? Or if he does, is that an issue with the associations? I think Arnold's got the influence. We can go to talk to him like Jim Lorimer, etc. He can go and talk to Jim Mannion, and he can say to them, this is what he was like that back in the day. He can do it now. He has that power if he wants. It's a big issue. You might be coming up against some of the officials, but can he get some of those officials on side and have them support his view? If he wants to, yes. Steve, I will do the out as we go. As always, please note, we are not doctors, and the opinions in these podcasts are ours and ours alone. It is our view, and it is based on our experience and views on the topic, which comes from many years. Our podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. There's freedom of speech and the First Amendment of replies.